I'm not sure there's a single moment in my life that felt more surreal than the afternoon I came home from the hospital a few hours before my usual shift ended. I'm a nurse, and sometimes management asks me to clock out early if the patient load is low. That day, I'd been looking forward to surprising my husband, James. For over 2 decades, we'd shared our lives in what I believed was a stable, loving marriage. We met when I was just 18, although he was 25 at the time. Our courtship was whirlwind and exciting, full of stolen kisses in the back of my mother's car and secret plans for our future. It never crossed my mind that anyone could come between us, especially not my own mother. I'd left work around noon, thinking maybe I could surprise him by cooking his favorite meal. He was usually in his home office around that time, working on a financial report or talking to clients. So, I took off my scrubs in the car, slipped on a sundress I kept stashed in the trunk, and rushed inside. I wasn't expecting the house to be silent. My footsteps echoed in the foyer. A chill shot down my spine as I realized there was a strange hush blanketing everything. No television, no tapping keyboard, no voices. I moved quietly, each step feeling heavier than the last, until I heard the faintest moan drifting from upstairs. At first, I thought someone might be hurt. Then I heard another sound that made me stop breathing altogether. I don't remember climbing the stairs. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. The air felt thick, and my vision narrowed to a dark tunnel with just enough space to see the outline of the bedroom door. My bedroom door, the one I had walked through so many times with a heart full of love and trust. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I caught my mother's voice. She spoke in breathless gasps, a tone I had never associated with her, and I heard James respond with a low groan. In that split second, everything I believed about my life crumbled. I stood paralyzed, forced to listen to the woman who raised me and the man I married in a passionate embrace. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. If someone had asked me how I expected to react to such a discovery, I might have guessed I'd barge into the room, scream, or maybe burst into tears. But the reality was so much stranger. It was as though I had left my body entirely. My mind became clear, frighteningly calm. I pushed the door open, and there they were, my mother's nails digging into James's back, his hands gripping her hips. For a moment, the three of us stared at each other in silent horror, like we were frozen in a twisted tableau. Then my mother scrambled away, clutching the sheets to her chest, while James fumbled for his pants, stammering my name like an excuse might magically fix it all. I've replayed that moment in my mind countless times since then. The way my mother's hair was tousled, the flushed look on her face that reminded me of a teenager caught sneaking out. And James. I'd never seen him so vulnerable, so desperate to contain a secret that had just exploded into the world. I didn't scream, I didn't weep. I stood there, and a single sentence escaped my lips. "Pack your things and get out." My voice sounded alien, as though someone else was speaking through me. My mother's eyes welled with tears, and she tried to say my name, but I shut her down with a look. Everything inside me felt cold and unforgiving. Betrayal was an insufficient word for what I felt in that instant. James left that day, but my mother didn't. She lived with me in that house ever since my father walked out years ago and left her with 2 young twins to raise. My twin brothers, Ben and Connor, were just 13 when Dad took off, so I was the one who practically helped raise them once I got married and settled down. They were 17 now, freshly minted high school seniors, full of teenage swagger. They weren't home at the time of the discovery, and I had no idea how or even if I'd explain what happened. But that very evening, as my mother tried to apologize in a shaky voice, she dropped another bomb. My precious brothers were not my father's biological children. They were James's. I remember staring at her, my mouth open, unable to form words. The timeline didn't make sense to me at first. She said the affair began right around the time I turned 18, shortly after James and I started dating. My mother insisted it was a mistake, a confusing whirlwind of emotions that spiraled out of control. They had been seeing each other sporadically behind my back, and not long after, she discovered she was pregnant. She let my father believe the babies were his because by then, she had cut things off with James, at least temporarily. She swore she ended it for good once she realized I was serious about him, but apparently, that wasn't the end of their twisted liaison. It never truly ended. It just went underground. It was too much to process. I felt like every memory from my 18th birthday onward had been poisoned. My mother tried to beg for forgiveness, crying and saying she never meant to hurt me. But each tear only fueled my rage. I told her I wished she'd never moved into my home, that she'd never tried to be part of my life. It was a cruel thing to say, perhaps, but in that moment, I wanted her to feel the same devastation I did. Then she dropped to her knees, sobbing that she had nowhere to go, that Dad's abandonment left her financially dependent on me. I walked away, locked myself in my room, and listened to her plead through the door until her voice was raw. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. Rage, heartbreak, and a nauseating sense of betrayal churned inside me. I kept picturing James with my mother, replaying every moment in my head. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I couldn't just make them leave. There was something far more potent brewing in my mind: revenge. People often talk about how vengeance corrodes the soul, but I didn't care about moral lessons or the high road. I wanted them both to suffer in a way that matched my torment. I thought about my mother's precarious situation, how she depended on me, and I thought about James, whose entire career I had helped build by supporting him financially when he started his little consultancy. I decided the first step was to meet with a lawyer and start the divorce process. I wanted to ensure that James wouldn't walk away with a single cent more than he deserved. We'd been married for 22 years, but I realized how foolish I had been to trust him so blindly. I gathered financial documents, bank statements, and credit card bills. At the same time, I began setting a trap. I knew James would try to come back, pleading for forgiveness. I wanted evidence, text messages, emails, anything that proved the full extent of this betrayal. I installed a hidden camera in the living room and a voice recorder near the phone. My hands shook as I did it, but I couldn't stop. My desire for justice fueled me. Sure enough, James started calling incessantly. He left voicemails, sent me text messages that ran the gamut from remorseful to manipulative. He claimed he'd always loved me, that sleeping with my mother was a horrific mistake, that it was a long-buried affair which he'd tried to end but never found the right way to do so. My mother, meanwhile, retreated into a silent, guilt-ridden shell. She stayed in her room mostly, emerging only to cook meals for the twins as if nothing had changed. Ben and Connor noticed the tension, but they had no idea how deep the fissure ran. I wasn't ready to tell them yet. They might be James's biological sons, but I couldn't bear to see them hurt, though I knew they eventually deserved the truth. Part of me wanted to scream at my mother to leave, but I recognized the leverage I had over her as an opportunity. She was desperate to stay. I let her remain under my roof, but our interactions were tense and minimal. She tried to explain her reasons, blaming her loneliness and my father's neglect. She claimed James pursued her, that he manipulated her vulnerabilities. Whether that was true or not, I didn't care. She had made her choice. When James finally mustered the courage to show up on my doorstep, I made sure my cameras and recorders were ready. I let him talk, let him spin his sob story about how everything had been a mistake. I kept my responses measured, coaxing out every incriminating detail I could. He confessed to everything. He admitted the affair had begun long before we were married. He expressed guilt about fathering my brothers, claiming he'd never intended for that to happen. He even admitted that part of him had felt jealous of my father's role in the twins' lives, though he tried to bury it. I recorded all of it. When he was done, I coldly thanked him for his honesty and asked him to leave. I thought he might argue or beg, but he just looked tired, defeated. After that, I sent the evidence to my lawyer. I wanted to ensure that the court saw James for the liar he was, that no judge would ever side with him if he tried to dispute spousal support or property division. Meanwhile, I was still seething at my mother. I wanted her gone, but evicting her outright might jeopardize the delicate legal situation with James. Also, I couldn't deny a part of me wanted her close by so I could make her regret every single choice that led us here. I stopped speaking to her except when absolutely necessary. Anytime she tried to talk about her guilt, I would cut her off. The tension in the house became so thick that even Ben and Connor, who were typically absorbed in their teenage world, started asking questions. I dodged them for weeks, focusing on finalizing my divorce papers and funneling money into a separate account. But I knew I couldn't keep them in the dark forever. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. James officially had no claim to my house or my earnings. I had secured a favorable settlement that left him with only a fraction of what he had hoped for. I took a grim satisfaction in that. But the moment I walked out of the courthouse, I realized I still had the rest of my life to face. My mother and I were barely on speaking terms, my brothers were living under a roof built on lies, and I was alone, haunted by 2 decades of betrayal. I decided it was time for the truth to come out, for the final blow to be struck. Maybe that would help me heal, or maybe not, but I had to do it. I gathered Ben and Connor in the living room that evening. My mother sat in a corner, her face pale. I told them the entire story, sparing none of the ugly details. They needed to know who their real father was, and they needed to understand why I couldn't continue living with the lie. My brothers were shell-shocked. Ben started yelling, demanding answers from our mother. Connor just kept shaking his head, tears in his eyes, unable to process the betrayal. My mother tried to console them, but they pushed her away. In that moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she'd stolen so much of my own happiness, and any pity I had vanished. I was done protecting her. Ben ran out of the house, and Connor followed. I heard the roar of a car engine moments later, and then they were gone. My mother sat sobbing on the couch, and I couldn't even look at her. I left her there and retreated to the backyard, where I stood under the fading light, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. My mind flicked through every memory I had of James playing basketball with the boys, my mother cheering them on. None of those moments were as innocent as I'd believed. That's when I heard my mother's voice behind me, soft and broken. She said she wished she could turn back time, that she knew she deserved my hatred. I didn't turn around. I stood there, arms crossed, letting her words drift away in the breeze. Finally, she asked what I wanted her to do. Leave? Stay and let me punish her? She was begging for any form of absolution. I turned to face her, and for the first time, I saw not my mother, but a desperate stranger who had upended my life. I told her she could stay, but only because of Ben and Connor. They needed a parent, and she might be their only stable link to some sense of normalcy. However, I warned her that if she expected forgiveness, she would be disappointed. I told her we would never be mother and daughter again, that she'd killed that bond the moment she climbed into bed with James. She looked like I had struck her across the face, but I felt no pity. Over the next few weeks, the house was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. Ben and Connor eventually returned, but they were distant and angry. They directed most of that anger at our mother, though I felt its edges too. I tried not to take it personally. After all, they had just learned their entire identity was a lie. James tried calling them, texting them, wanting to claim his place as their father, but they refused to speak to him. They called him a coward, a liar. I secretly relished their fury. It felt like a shred of the justice I'd been seeking, though I also knew it left them broken inside. Time passed, though the wounds never fully healed. I continued working at the hospital, throwing myself into long shifts to avoid the tension at home. My mother remained in the guest room, cooking meals for the twins, trying to mend what she could of their relationship. We coexisted like awkward strangers, crossing paths in the hallway without speaking. People say forgiveness is a virtue, but I found no virtue in letting go of this betrayal. My mother and James had stolen something irreplaceable from me, the faith I had in family, the trust I had in love. Every so often, James would appear at the front door, or I'd spot his car parked down the street. I never let him in. He was dead to me. Then one late evening, almost a year after the divorce, I received a frantic call from James's sister. He had been in a bad car accident. She said he was in critical condition at a different hospital across town. I felt a flicker of something, pity maybe, or curiosity. Against my better judgment, I drove over. I found him in the ICU, barely conscious. Tubes snaked out of his body and a machine beeped steadily by his bed. His sister hovered nearby, tears in her eyes. She asked if I could talk to him, that maybe he needed to hear my voice. I stared down at him, remembering the man I had once loved. Then I thought of everything he'd done, the lies, the betrayal. My heart hardened. He opened his eyes briefly, recognized me, and whispered my name. His sister nudged me closer, hoping I might offer some comfort. I leaned in, my face inches from his, and told him in a voice only he could hear that I was there to watch him suffer. His eyes flickered with a mixture of pain and regret, and a tear slipped down his cheek. In that instant, I felt an icy satisfaction. I'd always wondered if I would forgive him on his deathbed, or if pity would override my anger. It didn't. I turned and left the room. I didn't ask about his prognosis, and I didn't care. My revenge was complete in that moment. He knew I would never grant him absolution. I later learned he survived, though his recovery was long and arduous. Ben and Connor chose not to visit him. They barely spoke to our mother anymore, except to let her know where they were going or when they'd be home. The three of them existed in a fragile detente while I continued to drift further away. I took on more shifts at work, sometimes volunteering for overnight duty just to escape the house. People told me I seemed hardened, that the once warm person they knew had become distant. I felt it too. I'd built walls around my heart, determined to let no one inside ever again. My mother tried, in her own way, to offer help or kindness, but I rejected every gesture. She had lost that right. Sometimes I wonder if I robbed myself of peace by refusing to forgive. Yet, every time I recall that bedroom scene and the revelation about my brothers, my resolve hardens. The price of betrayal was my mercy, and that is one luxury I will never grant them.